In November of 1902, in the basement of the United States Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C., 12 young men sat down to a formal dinner. Their host was Dr. Harvey Washington Wiley, chief chemist of the Bureau of Chemistry. Halfway through the meal, a measured dose of borax was slipped into their food inside a gelatin capsule. Newspapers would soon call them the Poison Squad. The question is simple. Why did the federal government have to secretly dose its own volunteers just to prove that food and medicine needed regulating at all? For most of the 19th century, there was no such requirement. A company could bottle a syrup, put a picture of a sleeping infant on the label, and say nothing at all about what was inside. There was no federal law demanding it. There was no federal agency positioned to stop it. This wasn't an oversight buried in some minor statute. It was a total absence, a vacuum at the center of American commerce. And for decades, almost nobody in power seemed interested in closing it. That indifference wasn't for lack of trying by a handful of reformers. Congress had seen some version of a pure food bill introduced nearly every year for more than 2 decades before 1906, and nearly every one had died quietly in committee, buried by an industry with thousands of different products on the market and no shortage of money to spend defending all of them. By one estimate common among historians of the period, patent medicines represented one of the single largest categories of advertising revenue in the entire American newspaper industry by the turn of the century. Newspapers rarely investigated their own biggest advertisers, and patent medicine manufacturers understood that as clearly as anyone in the business. Into that vacuum, in 1849, a Bangor, Maine druggist named Jeremiah Curtis and his partner Benjamin Perkins began selling a product called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. It was marketed for teething infants, promising to soothe the child, soften the gums, and cure colic. The label showed a plump, contented baby in a mother's arms. What the label did not show was that each fluid ounce contained roughly 65 milligrams of morphine, suspended in alcohol. There was no law requiring Curtis and Perkins to disclose that. There was no agency that could have forced them to. The product became a fixture in American households for generations, sold in Britain and France as well as the United States, and it made its makers wealthy. It wasn't even the first of its kind. Godfrey's Cordial, an opium-laced syrup for fussy infants, had been sold on both sides of the Atlantic since the 18th century. Mrs. Winslow's simply did, on a larger and more profitable scale, what quieter products had already been doing for 100 years. Food adulteration carried its own body count long before Wiley ever reached Washington. In New York City through the 1850s, a scandal journalist called Swill Milk saw thousands of dairy cows kept in filthy stalls attached to city distilleries, fed nothing but the hot mash left over from whiskey production, and milked for a thin, bluish liquid doctored with chalk, plaster, or molasses to look and taste like the real thing before it was sold to city families. Infant mortality in some tenement districts was, by later public health accounts, connected directly to the practice. There was no federal law to stop it then either. It took local reformers and a crusading press to shut down the worst of the swill milk dairies, city by city, decades before Washington ever took the same problem seriously on a national scale. By the time Wiley took up the cause decades later, milk adulteration had never actually gone away. It had only become quieter and better disguised. Mrs. Winslow's was not an isolated case. Across the patent medicine industry, a term that described products protected by trademark rather than actual government patent, this was simply how business was done. A widely sold tonic called Peruna marketed itself as a cure for catarrh and general debility. Nothing on the label told you that, by later testing, it was roughly 28% alcohol. A product called Liquozone claimed to be endorsed by prominent physicians and respected Chicago institutions. Some of those endorsements, once checked, turned out not to hold up. The shelf went on. Lydia E. Pinkham's vegetable compound, marketed directly to women for female complaints, ran nearly 20% alcohol by some period estimates. Sold under the folksy image of a kindly grandmother whose face appeared on every bottle and in newspaper advertisements across the country. Hostetter's Stomach Bitters, advertised as a digestive tonic, was strong enough in alcohol content that in dry counties under early temperance laws, it was reportedly sold as medicine specifically because liquor could not be. Cocaine turned up too, not hidden in a back alley product, but printed openly in advertisements for cocaine toothache drops marketed for children. Instantaneous cure, the promise on the label. A coca leaf wine called Vin Mariani, imported from France, was popular enough among public figures of the era that its maker collected endorsements from the likes of Thomas Edison and, reportedly, Pope Leo XIII. And in its original 1886 formulation, before any law forced a change, Coca-Cola itself contained an extract of coca leaf. None of this required a warning. None of it broke a single federal law, because no federal law existed to break. That's the detail worth sitting with. It was not fraud in the legal sense, because there was no federal statute defining what counted as fraud in a bottle. The industry Samuel Hopkins Adams would later describe as built on undiluted deception was, by the letter of American law, doing nothing wrong at all. Harvey Wiley had watched this world take shape for years before he ever tried to change it. Born on an Indiana farm in 1844, he served briefly in the Union Army as a young man before earning a medical degree in 1871 and turning fully toward chemistry, an unusual combination of training that let him speak, credibly, both to what a substance was doing to a body and to what it actually was. Trained first in medicine and then in chemistry, he had taught at Purdue University before the Department of Agriculture brought him to Washington in 1883 to run its Bureau of Chemistry. Food and drug adulteration was, by then, an ordinary, unremarkable feature of American life. Preservatives like borax, formaldehyde, and copper sulfate were routinely added to meat, milk, and butter to disguise spoilage or extend shelf life, with no requirement that anyone tell the customer. Wiley could analyze a sample. He could publish a finding. He could not force a company to change a label, because no law said the label had to be honest. It wasn't quack doctors selling snake oil on street corners. It was a fully legal, highly profitable, well-advertised industry, protected by the very newspapers and magazines that depended on its advertising revenue to survive. Some patent medicine contracts of the period reportedly went further than ordinary advertising business. Historians of the trade press describe a clause, sometimes called the Red Clause, written directly into advertising agreements between manufacturers and newspapers. If a state legislature passed any law restricting the sale or labeling of patent medicines, the advertiser could cancel every contract with that paper immediately. A newspaper that ran a full page of patent medicine advertising every week had a very direct financial reason to oppose the exact kind of law Wiley was trying to build. The cost of that gap wasn't abstract. It showed up in specific bottles, in specific households, over and over, for decades. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup did what a large dose of morphine will do to a small child. Some infants who were given it, following the dosing instructions printed right on the bottle, went to sleep and never woke up. Doctors of the period would later document these deaths. Though no single national count exists, the pattern was clear well before any government agency was positioned to act on it. Journalist and historian accounts describe the syrup's grim nickname among some physicians, the baby killer. And still, there was no law against selling it, no requirement to warn a parent what was inside, no federal body with the authority to pull it from shelves. Wiley understood, by the turn of the century, that testimonials and lab reports weren't going to be enough. He'd spent years publishing analyses of adulterated food, and Congress had largely ignored him. What Congress hadn't ignored, historically, was spectacle. So, in 1902, Wiley asked Congress for $5,000 to fund what he called the Hygienic Table Trials, a study, in his own words, to investigate food preservatives and their effects on digestion and health. According to FDA historian Suzanne White Junod, Congress approved the funding without, it seems, entirely grasping what they were signing off on. What they'd authorized was a set of controlled human feeding experiments run out of a government basement, using federal employees and Georgetown Medical College students as the test subjects. Wiley reportedly insisted the volunteers be young, unmarried men with no dependents, a quiet acknowledgement, before the trials even began, of exactly how much risk he understood himself to be taking with their health. By some accounts, women who wrote in asking to join the study were turned away outright, Wiley unwilling to risk any unknown effect on their future health. A decision that said as much about the assumptions of 1902 as it did about the chemistry itself. The data those 5 years produced would be cited by public health researchers for decades afterward, one of the few genuinely lasting scientific legacies of a study that began, on paper, as a modest $5,000 request. The volunteers ate 3 meals a day in that basement dining room. A cook named Perry prepared roast chicken, braised beef, ordinary American food, and into it, one substance at a time, hidden inside gelatin capsules so the men couldn't taste what they were eating, Wiley's staff introduced borax, then formaldehyde, then salicylic acid, then copper sulfate. The men were weighed weekly. Their pulse and temperature were logged. Their urine and stool were collected for analysis. Wiley described his own laboratory, without apparent irony, as the most highly advertised boarding house in the world. The Washington Press had already given the study its lasting name, the Poison Squad, and newspaper cartoonists of the day ran illustrations of the volunteers seated at a table set with skull and crossbones place cards, played for dark comedy in the same papers that carried patent medicine ads on the facing page. A comic song about the squad made its way into vaudeville halls, sung for laughs by audiences who, most of them, had no idea their own pantries held the same chemicals in smaller, unmeasured doses. It was not without resistance from the inside. By the summer of 1903, after nearly a year on borax, the volunteers had had enough. They went on strike, refusing to eat any more of the preservative until conditions changed. The formaldehyde trial had to be stopped early entirely. The symptoms it produced were too severe to continue in good conscience, even by the loose standards of 1903 human research. None of this happened quietly. Reporters, cut off from direct access to Wiley himself, took to interviewing the squad's cook through the kitchen window just to find out what was on the menu that day. For 5 years, from 1902 to 1907, this rotating group of volunteers kept eating measured doses of chemicals most Americans were already consuming unknowingly in their everyday food. And the entire time, lobbyists for the preservative and patent medicine industries worked to discredit Wiley's findings and keep them out of legislation. This is where the story could have stayed a stubborn chemist, a basement experiment, years of stalled bills in Congress. It didn't stay there, because 2 other forces arrived on the same timeline, and together they closed a gap that Wiley alone had spent 20 years trying to close. The first was a journalist. In October of 1905, Samuel Hopkins Adams began publishing a series in Collier's Weekly, under editor Norman Hapgood, titled The Great American Fraud. Over 11 installments, Adams laid out, brand by brand, exactly what the patent medicine industry was selling and what it was actually made of. He estimated, by his own count, that Americans were spending some $75 million a year on these products, a contemporary journalist's figure. Not a verified government statistic, but a number that landed hard in 1905. Adams devoted a section to what he called the baby killers, walking through soothing syrups like Mrs. Winslow's and the documented pattern of infant deaths connected to them. He named names. He printed diagrams comparing the alcohol content of Peruna to a bottle of whiskey. He published a letter from a Chicago physician denying an endorsement that Liquozone had been citing for years. It was, in effect, a public trial conducted in the pages of a mass circulation magazine, one the patent medicine industry had no legal standing to stop, because nothing Adams printed was false. Some manufacturers threatened legal action anyway. None of those threats ever turned into a case Adams lost, because he had built the series out of public records, chemical assay results, and denials obtained directly from the physicians whose names had been used without their consent. Adams was not working alone in spirit, even if he was working alone on the page. The American Medical Association had, that same year, formed its own Council on Pharmacy and Chemistry to independently evaluate drug claims, and it later reprinted Adams' series as a standalone pamphlet distributed to physicians nationwide under the title The Great American Fraud. The campaign outlived the magazine series that helped launch it. In 1911, the AMA's propaganda department, led by a physician named Arthur J. Cramp, who had joined the campaign in part after losing his own daughter to a quack medical treatment, compiled years of these findings into a bound reference volume titled Nostrums and Quackery, distributed to doctors as a standing catalog of which products on the market were, by the association's own investigation, worthless or dangerous. It became something like an ongoing, unofficial enforcement mechanism, precisely because the federal law Wiley had built still could not do that job itself. Then, in February of 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle. It was a novel about the Chicago meatpacking industry, focused on labor conditions more than food safety, but its most visceral passages, describing what actually went into processed meat, landed in front of a reading public already primed by 2 years of Adams' reporting and Wiley's ongoing chemical trials. Sinclair himself would later say of the public reaction that he had aimed at the public's heart and, by accident, hit it in the stomach instead. Readers came away disturbed by what was in their food not by the labor conditions he had actually written the book to expose. President Roosevelt read it, and by most accounts was genuinely disturbed enough to act, but not disturbed enough to simply take a novelist's word for it. He sent his own investigators, Labor Commissioner Charles P. Neal and social worker James Bronson Reynolds, into the Chicago stockyards to verify Sinclair's claims firsthand. Their report, delivered directly to Roosevelt, confirmed conditions nearly as bad as the novel described. Roosevelt reportedly used the threat of releasing the Neal-Reynolds findings publicly as leverage against meatpacking lobbyists who were still fighting the inspection bill in Congress, a warning that if the industry kept blocking the legislation, the government's own investigators would say so, in print, under the president's name. Even as the bill moved through Congress that spring, the meatpacking industry kept fighting over its details. Packers objected to a provision requiring them to pay for their own federal inspections and separately pushed hard for the right to stamp their products with an official government seal of approval, a mark they clearly understood would work as free advertising, reassuring customers who had just spent months reading about worse. Congress ultimately shifted the inspection costs onto the federal government rather than the industry, a compromise that softened packer resistance without softening the underlying law. Historians differ on exactly how much weight to give each factor: Wiley's chemistry, Adams' journalism, Sinclair's fiction, Roosevelt's own investigators. Some treat Sinclair's novel as the decisive spark. Others see it as one pressure among several converging on Congress in the same season. What's not in dispute is the timing. By the spring of 1906, the Poison Squad's decade of quiet chemistry, Adams' public naming of specific frauds, and Sinclair's novel, backed now by the president's own confirmed report, had all landed within the same 18-month window, in front of the same Congress, at the same moment. It wasn't the poison that changed the law. It was the publicity around the poison, arriving from 4 directions at once, that finally moved a bill. On the 30th of June 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the Pure Food and Drugs Act. He signed the Meat Inspection Act the same day. The Pure Food and Drugs Act prohibited the manufacture, sale, or transportation of adulterated or misbranded food, drugs, medicines, and liquors moving through interstate commerce. It would come to be known, informally, as the Wiley Act, named for the man who had spent 2 decades building the case for it, one gelatin capsule at a time. For a moment, it looked like the vacuum had closed. It hadn't, not entirely, and the shape of what remained open is the part of this story most people never hear. The 1906 Act did something narrower than most people assume. It required companies to disclose on their labels if a product contained alcohol, morphine, opium, heroin, cocaine, or cannabis. It did not ban any of those ingredients. It did not require the ingredients to meet any standard of purity. It did not give federal inspectors sweeping authority to pull a dangerous product off the shelf simply because it was dangerous. The law made the danger visible. It did not make the danger illegal. That distinction had consequences you could still buy over a drugstore counter for years afterward. Past rows of glass jars and colorful bottles, a druggist reaching for the same familiar labels he'd been selling for decades. Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, now legally required to print contains morphine somewhere on its label, kept selling the same cheerful baby illustration, the same recipe, now with a small printed admission beside it. The American Medical Association didn't formally denounce the product until 1911. The company didn't remove morphine from the formula until sometime around 1915. The syrup itself stayed on store shelves into the 1930s. The label had changed. For years, the bottle had not. And in 1911, the law's reach narrowed further still. The case was United States v. Johnson, and it concerned a Kansas City doctor selling a compound he claimed could cure cancer. The Supreme Court sat that spring to decide a single, narrow question. Did the 1906 Act's ban on misbranding cover false claims about what a product could cure, or only false statements about what a product contained? Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the opinion. He ruled that the law reached only the ingredient list, not the promise on the label. A company could still legally claim its tonic cured cancer, consumption, or diabetes, so long as it accurately listed what was in the bottle. The bench, the briefs, the careful legal reasoning, none of it changed the fact that a dying man could still walk into a drugstore and buy a bottle promising to save his life, printed with a truthful list of ingredients and a lie about what they could do. The law that Wiley had spent his career fighting for now had a Supreme Court-shaped hole in it, right where its enforcement teeth should have been. Wiley was fighting battles inside his own building at the same time. His direct superior, Secretary of Agriculture James Wilson, was, by most historical accounts, considerably more sympathetic to industry concerns than Wiley ever was, and increasingly uncomfortable with how aggressively his chief chemist was interpreting the new law. In 1907, a Board of Food and Drug Inspection was established within the department, an internal layer of review that sat between Wiley's findings and any actual enforcement action, and one that industry lobbyists had quietly pushed for. The Bureau of Chemistry, that was now responsible for policing this new law across the entire scope of interstate American commerce, remained, for years, a small operation relative to the size of that task. Wiley remained chief chemist through these years, but by 1912 he had resigned from federal service, frustrated, by most historical accounts, with how the law he'd built was actually being enforced once it left his hands. He didn't disappear quietly. In 1929, he self-published a book titled The History of a Crime Against the Food Law, in which he argued, in his own words, that the Bureau had been made the sole judge of whether a product violated the statute, and that this arrangement had let the law's real force be quietly hollowed out from within. Wiley didn't retire into obscurity after he left government. He spent his final decades as the director of the Bureau of Foods, Sanitation, and Health at Good Housekeeping magazine, running the testing laboratory behind the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval, a private, commercial guarantee of exactly the kind of product honesty he had spent 30 years trying to force out of Washington. The seal he helped build still appears on products today. It is not a government mark. It never needed an act of Congress behind it. Wiley had left the machinery of federal enforcement and built, in its place, a private one, as if he no longer entirely trusted the government version to hold. There's a version of this story that ends in 1906, with Roosevelt's signature and a triumphant chemist. That's not the version the record actually supports. The real ending is slower, messier, and only partly resolved even now. Wiley died in 1930, the same year the Bureau of Chemistry's Food and Drug Enforcement functions were formally reorganized under a new name, the Food and Drug Administration, the agency that still exists today. It would take one more disaster to finish closing the gap Wiley had spent his life narrowing. In 1937, a Tennessee drug company called S.E. Massengill sold a liquid antibiotic, elixir sulfanilamide, without ever testing it for safety. The solvent used to dissolve the drug was diethylene glycol, the same chemical family used in antifreeze. More than 100 people died, many of them children. Under the 1906 Act, none of that had actually been illegal, because the law still had no requirement that a new drug be tested for safety before it reached a drugstore shelf. It took the deaths of 1,937 to pass the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, the law that finally gave the FDA the authority Wiley had spent his whole career reaching for and never quite received while he was alive to see it. Even that wasn't the last gap. The 1938 Act closed the safety question, but it never asked whether a drug actually worked. That question sat open for another 24 years, until 1962, when a sedative called thalidomide, prescribed to pregnant women in dozens of countries, was found to cause severe birth defects in thousands of infants abroad. The United States was largely spared a domestic version of that tragedy for one specific reason. An FDA medical reviewer named Francis Kelsey refused to approve the drug for the American market repeatedly over the manufacturer's objections because the safety data she'd been given wasn't good enough. Congress responded that same year with the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, which finally required drug makers to prove a medicine was effective, not just that its ingredients were accurately labeled and not immediately dangerous. 56 years after Wiley's Act, the law had finally grown the teeth he'd spent his career trying to give it. Every ingredient panel on every bottle in your medicine cabinet, every ingredient list on a box in your pantry, exists because of the specific fight this man spent nearly 3 decades waging, and because 2 writers named specific brands in specific magazines at exactly the right moment for Congress to finally act, and because, more than once after that, it took real deaths before Congress finished a job Wiley had started alone in a basement. The gap Wiley closed was never fully closed. It was narrowed, again and again, usually after a body count. Historians and regulators have pointed out for decades since that the same basic tension, labeling and disclosure without full authority to restrict in advance, still shapes how the modern FDA regulates dietary supplements an industry now measured in tens of billions of dollars a year. Under the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994, a supplement manufacturer does not need FDA approval before selling a product. The agency can act only after it has evidence the product is unsafe, not before. That after-the-fact model isn't hypothetical. In 2003, a Baltimore Orioles pitcher named Steve Beckler collapsed and died during spring training after taking a supplement containing ephedra, a stimulant already linked, by that point, to more than 16,000 adverse event reports the FDA had been collecting for years without the authority to act on in advance. The agency banned ephedra from dietary supplements in 2004, not before the reports piled up, but after. In 2015, the New York Attorney General's office ran DNA barcode testing on store-brand herbal supplements sold at 4 major national retailers and announced that the large majority of tested products showed no genetic trace of the herb listed on the label at all, some containing only rice, houseplant material, or ingredients never listed anywhere on the bottle. Botanical scientists later disputed whether DNA barcoding was even a valid method for testing processed herbal extracts, where the plant's DNA is often destroyed during manufacturing, a genuine scientific argument that was never fully resolved. But the underlying problem the dispute exposed was real, regardless of who was right about the test. A label the customer had no reliable way to verify, and a regulator with no authority to check it before it reached the shelf. The pattern Wiley spent his career fighting didn't end with his signature act, or the 1938 law passed after his death, or even the 1962 amendment that followed the thalidomide scare. Each time, the fix arrived only after real people had already been harmed under a law that made the danger visible without making it illegal, a design flaw baked into the very first version of the act and never fully corrected in any of the versions that followed. It just moved into a new category of product, decades later, with the same basic shape. The Poison Squad itself never really left the agency's own memory. The FDA's official historical materials and museum exhibits still return to that basement dining room as the place the agency likes to say its own story actually begins. Harvey Wiley spent the last years of his life insisting that the law bearing his name had not gone far enough. In 1929, writing alone, with no committee behind him and no more bills left to pass, he put that conclusion into print himself. Today, that same tension sits quietly on a shelf near you, a supplement bottle. A label listing ingredients, but making almost no promise about what any regulator actually verified before you swallowed it. It's the same gap Wiley spent his life narrowing, never quite closed. If you know another piece of this hidden institutional history, tell it in the comments below. Subscribe for the next one.